Good evening and welcome to Q&A live from the Great Hall of Parliament House in Canberra. I'm Tony Jones, here to welcome us, Ngunnawal custodians Billy Tompkins and Jude Barlow.
Kia mora, Sese. Mulia Minjikawe, Yangabali, Yera, Narwa, Mangara, Mangara, Yangabele, Yera, Manabadi, Yaramada, Narwa Dora, Mangere, Mulia, Eagle in the sky.
On behalf of my Ngunnawal elders, past, present and future, I welcome you to Ngunnawal country. We are gathered in the Parliament of Australia to discuss the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution. And we welcome all Australians, all of our parliamentarians and all Indigenous people to our country and to this important discussion.
Thank you very much, Billy and Jude. Now, joining me to answer your questions tonight, University of New South Wales Law Professor Megan Davis, the co-chair of the Referendum Council canvassing changes to the Constitution, Pat Anderson, the founder of the Cape York Partnership, Noel Pearson, playwright, performer and commentator Nakia Louie, and ABC Indigenous Affairs editor Stan Grant. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia. It's live everywhere else on the ABC News channel at 9:45 Eastern Standard Time. You can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope if you're in a submarine. Now, we've all gathered here in the Great Hall of Parliament House just a few days after a national meeting of Indigenous Australians at Uluru, which set an ambitious agenda for constitutional reform. They'll need the backing of the Parliament and the support of the majority of Australians in the majority of states to change the Australian Constitution. Can they repeat the success of 67? Our first question tonight comes from Dennis Foley.
What am I? Back in 1967, I was a skinny little kid handing out leaflets at a polling booth in Manly with my uncle. And I was also a runaway ward of the state. And I'll never forget this big fella in a grey suit and a hat spat on me. He called me a name. And it wasn't the first time I've been spat on as a black fella, and it won't be the last probably. But the elders supported me and said, look, things are going to change after the referendum. Things will be for the better. But I stand here now in my silver years. I see more kids getting taken away now than what they did when I was taken away. I see more babies dying, far too young. I see more of our brothers and sisters being incarcerated. And where's the rest of my generation? They're gone. I'm almost alone. And yet, you know, 50 years on, we've got a talk fest at Uluru. Can we change things? Are we going to be in another 50 years navel-gazing and having meetings and talking about these things? When is something going to improve?
Noel Pearson.
I was 2 years old when the referendum came, so I spent 2 years a non-citizen. I think my people had no idea that the referendum was going on. We were stuck in the mission. And the achievement of the 67 referendum was on the shoulders of a whole lot of activists going back early in the 20th century who were crying out for justice and who brought about our citizenship. We've made progress in the last 50 years, but some of the profound indicators of our problems, children alien from parents, the most incarcerated people on the planet Earth, and youth in great numbers in detention, obviously speak to a structural problem. It can't be just because we are poorly behaved or we're personally, powerless. It's a structural situation. And 50 years later, we've got to address the structural problem of Indigenous disempowerment. I think we have an opportunity with constitutional reform to finally tackle the thing that old Bill Stanner wrote about 50, 60, 70 years ago, about the torment of our powerlessness. And this country's never grasped the nettle of the structural situation in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live. I think we finally have an opportunity to do that. And Dennis, I'm optimistic that if we seize this opportunity, we can turn around those really powerless indicators of our kind of structural disempowerment.
Pat Anderson.
The white man's not going to relinquish?
Sorry, say that again?
Aren't we asking for things or demanding things that the white man won't relinquish?
All right, Pat, let's hear from you on that.
In the Uluru Statement, we asked for the Australian public, all of you and everybody listening, to join us on a trek, I think that was the word that we used, so we could give us, in 67, we asked to be counted. In 2017, we're asking to be heard. We are voiceless and powerless in our own lands. This is our country. We've been here for 60,000 years. There has to be substantive change, structural change that will make a difference. We're going to have another. We've been asking for this, nothing is new, since prior 1840, and nobody listens and hears us. I don't understand that. What is it that we're not saying that you can't understand? So hopefully, I'm hopeful that this is an opportunity. I think Australia is ready for it. I think we're mature enough and sophisticated enough to have this, what might be a difficult conversation, but for goodness sake, let's have it and be done with it.
Just a quick one, Pat. Do you think the political class, and particularly, let's say, those from the Country Party or the more conservative side of politics, are ready to support and back, in a bipartisan way, substantive change? Because what came out of the Uluru Statement were serious, big changes to the Constitution.
The only gains we've ever made in this country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, has been through our own activism and joined by other people. That's why we're appealing to the Australian public. The politicians, they do what they do. But we, the Australian public, we might do otherwise, might we?
Stan Grant, let me come to you. You've made a documentary about the 67 referendum. What are your reflections listening to that story of someone who was spat on while campaigning for it? Do you think this referendum campaign could be in any way as inflammatory as some of the elements of that?
Well, if we look back to 1967, when I was making the documentary, spoke to my father, Dennis, and in his words, he said, "We were never Australians, we were outcasts." He may have technically been a citizen of Australia. He certainly did not enjoy the full benefits of that citizenship. Barred from being served in hotels, living on the outskirts of town, denied education. This is the reality of our lives, Dennis, and we know this. I think there's a couple of things to look at here. One, we have made progress individually and materially. We have more university graduates today than ever before. We're here on this stage tonight, an Indigenous voice in our parliament on national television, an Indigenous person beginning with the first question. And I think we need to acknowledge that, because our rights here are not predicated on our disadvantage. We could all be millionaires and we would still have inherent rights as Indigenous peoples. And that's just not us saying it. This is Australian law. At law, we have unique rights. Native title, and as a result of native title, a whole cascade of other rights, and a need to be able to mediate and negotiate when those rights come into conflict with the state. So I think we need to separate the disadvantage and the fact of our rights. I think when we come to the political question, it is undoubtedly a much more fractious and fractured political landscape that we live in today. A third of the Australian population, according to opinion polls, have no faith in either of the major parties. There are a proliferation of minor parties and individuals, particularly in our Senate, which make governing more difficult. To try to reach a consensus is going to be much more difficult today than it was then. And referenda, as we know, are difficult. 44 have been held, only 8 have been successful. It really comes down to the campaign. And I think, as Auntie Pat said, the ability to speak to the Australian people. In '67, at the height of the segregation and racism that you experienced and that our families lived through, 90+% of Australians said yes to the fundamental proposition of a fair go. Referendums are technical questions about the Constitution. But can you break that down to a fundamental question? What is the fair go? As Auntie Pat said, 67 we were counted. Now we want to be heard.
Now we want to be heard. That's the slogan you're talking about, essentially.
These things need to be captured in a way that people can relate to. How are we heard? How we create an architecture that gives voice to the political aspiration for Indigenous people, what form that takes, is still to be debated. But the question that we need to be heard, I don't think any serious thinking person in Australia could seriously dispute that we have such a long way to go in being able to deal with those questions of the disadvantage and get the voice that we need to be able to have influence on the policy that's directed towards us.
Now, Nakia, one of the second things that Dennis Foley, our questioner, said when he piped back up was something along the lines of, will privileged white men accept these kind of big changes? What do you think?
Here's the thing, the majority of the country aren't privileged white men. So it's not just privileged white men voting, it's all of us. Just to go back and say that what happened at Uluru was a talk fest, I think that really diminishes the responsibility that our fellow Aboriginal people took on while they're there. So even if we don't, for us, who knows how to help Aboriginal people, who are the best people to help Aboriginal people? It's us. And so it's really interesting. I caught up my mum and dad today because I wanted to ask them what were they doing on the day that the referendum took place. They were about 12 at the time, and honestly, they said, I can't remember. And I was getting ready to have this kind of bit of a, very kind of emotional talk fest. And so I was a bit taken aback, but I kept thinking about it. And what I realised is that 1967 was a testament to the fact that substantial change takes time. And symbolic change actually has effect within the cultural shift. So yes, my parents might not have seen the advantages of the referendum. They might still have faced racism through their lives. But the fact is, with that cultural shift combined with their hard work, I was able to have opportunity, and I'm able to sit here now. So I think Australians are capable of great change. And as an Australian, that's something that makes me very, very proud. So I think this idea that Australians don't want what's best for other people, that we don't want to give other people a fair go, I think, we're kind of, making the omelette before we crack the eggs. That's not a saying, I'm sorry.
Let me go to Megan, and we'll get everyone's opening statements first. Then we might get everyone to pause and give us slightly briefer answers. Otherwise, we won't get through all our questions. Megan.
Oh, what was the question?
Well, the question really was whether the sort of substantive change that was talked about at Uluru will actually be acceptable to the people in power. And I think the reference was to white men.
Well, I think it'll be acceptable to the Australian people, and I suppose that was what was important about Uluru, is that we weren't presenting it to a Prime Minister or a politician for it to sit on a shelf and gather dust. We were speaking to the Australian people from the heart of the country about the reasons why we need structural change. And I think it was really significant that it happened the day before the 50th anniversary of 1967, because 1967, while important, didn't deliver that kind of structural reform that our people need to gain control over their lives. So, look, the foundation of our constitution in terms of its being amended is the Australian people. While it's true that, you know, people are quite fond of citing that 8 out of 44 referendums, only 8 have succeeded, and those 8 have been bipartisan. While that is true, the other 44 were, by and large, you know, referendums Australians didn't agree with, and they thought it was, a lot of them, driven by the political elite. So in this case, that's not what's going on. This is not the political elite talking from Uluru. These were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people drawn from all over the country who came together and told us what I think is a very sophisticated and complex program of reform that they want to see implemented in their communities to get some control over their lives.
All right, let's try and get some detail of what those reforms might be. Our next question is from Chris Burke. Hi, Chris.
The race powers in our constitution are a hangover from those racist white Australia policies of the last century. Why then do we discuss removing them from the constitution as minimalism?
Noel Pearson.
Well, removing the race power and replacing it with a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's power was one of the 5 options that was the subject of 12 dialogues across the country. I was an advocate originally with the expert panel on it'd be good to change the word race to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs or peoples, but it gained no resonance in the, very little resonance in the dialogues across the country. People thought largely that would be a cosmetic change. It certainly wouldn't modify the power of the Commonwealth in any substantive way. People were more interested in a more substantial option such as the voice, giving people an institutional voice to the Parliament. So it was one of those things that came out in this 6-month-long process.
Can you just confirm it has been left out of the Uluru Statement?
It has been left out of the Uluru Statement.
So that was deliberate. That's not something you're coming back to. It's no longer a kind of demand. Is that right?
Yeah.
You need to wait until the referendum council hands down a report to look at the detail.
The dialogues provide advice to the referendum council, who then provide advice to the Parliament. And we were given 5 options to go out there and talk with people about. 3 of them are really, in my view, cosmetic changes to the Constitution. 2 of them are very substantial, the voice to the Parliament and a prohibition on racial discrimination. And they're 2 big-ticket items that require a lot of political understanding and support to get it through Parliament and to get the Australian people to endorse it. So yes, you know, the process of the dialogues was a process of people prioritising those 5 options.
So Noel, can I just confirm this? You just mentioned the prohibition on racial discrimination. There was a big move to have that written into the Constitution.
Correct.
An anti-discrimination section, which a lot of people regard as a mini Bill of Rights,
yes.
that will lead to activist judges. The constitutional conservatives are against that. Are you now in favour of it?
Oh no, we advocated that in the expert panel that Megan and I were members of in 2011. But very soon after we tabled that report with Prime Minister Gillard, a whole lot of ruction developed. It became very clear that a prohibition on racial discrimination was not going to get up through the Parliament. Remember, we've got 2 hurdles here. First hurdle, you've got to get it through this place. In fact, in my view, this whole constitutional challenge has these 2 hurdles, and the bigger hurdle is the one here. I think the Australian people are a lower hurdle to get over. And I think the Australian people were very well disposed to a racial discrimination prohibition. That's what the polling at the time told us. But of course, there was no chance of getting it through the Parliament. The Voice arose as an alternative to the prohibition.
Now, Noel, I'm going to come back to the Voice in a minute because we've got specific questions. And I just want to hear from the other panellists on this. And start with you. I mean, in your documentary, you look specifically at that clause in the Constitution. Sounds like you wanted it out.
Section 5126. Yep. Well, Section 5126, before 1967, said that the Parliament had the capacity to make laws for people of any race except Aboriginal people. After 67, that was crossed out. So then the Parliament had the capacity to make laws for any race of people. Since then, they have made laws for us. And that is not always, sometimes yes, but not always, to our benefit. And there have been several celebrated cases. I think why it's described as minimalism, Chris, is that just simply amending or removing doesn't create the architecture that's needed to give what is an extreme minority in Australia, Indigenous peoples, with unique rights in Australia, the political voice to be able to speak to power. That's what it doesn't do. So if you're looking for something more than minimalism, what you are looking for is how do we, in our democracy, ensure that we don't just live with majoritarian rule, but that we have a pluralist system that acknowledges the rights of those minorities who do not have power at the ballot box. And there are a whole range of options for being able to create that architecture from, as Noel and the Uluru Statement, Noel has spoken about and the Uluru Statement endorsed, a national representative body. There is talk of parliamentary seats, there is a Makarrata, treaties, a whole range of options. But why this is different to minimalism is that it would create an architecture through which Indigenous people's voices would be heard and those unique rights protected, and to mediate where those rights rub up against the state.
Okay, Pat and Megan, both of you, but start with Pat.
I can take it if you want.
Yeah.
So, well, one of the issues I think that will become apparent once the Referendum Council report's handed down is that we took a very different approach to the expert panel. The expert panel was not a detailed, deliberative process of walking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through the reforms. When we did run the dialogues and the discussion was had on the ways to fix this problem with the race power, and of course the issue with the race power is that it was altered in 1967, which we celebrated on Saturday. But we soon discovered in a High Court case in about 1998 that the power could potentially be used to support racially discriminatory legislation that's adverse to Aboriginal interests, that singles out Aboriginal people for adverse treatment. So since then, it's been on the agenda and somewhat of a challenge to work out, well, how do you draft then a clause that would fence in or discipline the federal parliament's power with respect to that? 116A was one suggestion by the expert panel. Another suggestion was something known as Section 51A, which had a statement of acknowledgement in it, and then the head of power. But, you know, we spent a lot of time working on that and a lot of feedback from government lawyers and politicians that they wouldn't allow us to put any language in the head of power to fence the parliament in, to discipline the parliament. The point I'm trying to make is that the conversations that were had in the dialogue were that the options on the table for addressing the race power would still be equivalent to the status quo. And I mean, Stan, you've come to a lot of the dialogues as well in the early leadership days. There would be no difference, and even if there were a lot of conversations had about dialogues about the risk of change because of the risk of unintended consequences and not knowing what a future High Court might look like. So the conversations were very, very detailed. The people in the dialogues ran a ruler across all of the options, including the race power, and what they did was to preference the changes that will actually make a difference to their lives on the ground. And that's why truth, treaty, and power or voice was what was preferenced more highly than changes to the race power that the dialogues at Uluru were not certain could guarantee that the federal parliament wouldn't pass.
Well, Megan, I'm going to interrupt you there so we can go to the question on power of voice, the voice to the parliament. Michael Davis has a question for us on this, and we can get into what is one of the big substantive changes you're proposing. Go ahead, Michael.
The Uluru Declarations call for a voice to be enshrined in the Constitution is welcome. I'd just like the panel's view on what that might look like and whether entrenching Indigenous peoples' representative body within the Constitution might lead to a lasting and real effective voice for participation by Indigenous peoples in the life of the nation.
Pat Anderson, what do you say to that?
I think that this is an attempt to give us a real voice that we can be heard, so we can have part in making the decisions that affect our daily lives, and that we can manage our communities and our families. So far, as I've said before, we remain voices. There is no structure that will allow us to have some power and authority. It must be enshrined in the Constitution so as it doesn't get dismissed by the stroke of a pen by some current minister. So it's a whole new way of giving us some power and authority so we can have a real say in the legislation and policy making that happens in Australia. That hasn't happened before. In the dialogues that we've been going around the country, people actually are yearning for the days of ATSIC where regional needs and issues were dealt with pretty much on a daily basis. And there have been other national bodies that we've set up previously that also have been dismissed at the whim of a current minister or the government that was out of favour. So we're looking for something now which we still have to put the meat on the bones, but will have some real authority, and if the government wants to change it or is dissatisfied with it, it's got to go to referendum again. So we're trying to give more solidarity, or make a more solid foundation here, which we haven't had in the past.
Noel Pearson, I'll bring you in because you proposed this idea back in 2014, essentially, and you've been obviously advocating it for some time. Can you just explain to the audience how it would actually work? Because, for example, Barnaby Joyce today is talking about it as being another chamber of Parliament, something sitting above the Senate, something will interfere with Parliament. Tell us how you see it working.
Well, the constitutional provision would say that Parliament would legislate the voice. So it would be up to Parliament to set out the design, how people are elected to it, what functions it would perform, and what powers it would have. So the constitutional provision will empower the Parliament to legislate that. Of course, the expectation would be that the Parliament would consult very assiduously with the Indigenous community about that design.
What would you expect it to look like, Noel? I mean, would it be an elected body to start with?
It would be elected by the First Nations. I think it's important to understand that the First Nations across the country, the tribes as they used to be called, or the language groups right across the country, it would be those units, the Gulkuyimidar people, my mob, the Wik people from Cape York, the Pitjantjatjara people, those people would select their representative to this national body, and legislation would set out their functions. It is a voice to the Parliament rather than a voice in the Parliament. It'll be hopefully a body that's established here in the Parliamentary Triangle in Canberra. In many ways, it will be the tent embassy in stone. Canvas, demountable, sandstone. We're going to formalise the Indigenous voice in this country. We're going to get out from under the fringes, out in the fringes and the shadows, and be put in the centre of action, the democratic action in this country. And its primary function will be to provide political and policy advice to this Parliament and to the government of the day.
But just a quick one, and very briefly, not to veto legislation, not to interfere with the political process.
It wouldn't have a role in the legislative process of the Parliament, but of course it will have salutary political effect. It will be a political organisation. It necessarily, if you're going to engage in the democracy, you're necessarily going to be political. And after all, this House is making policies and laws about us. We should be able to have a say in relation to what they do.
Okay, before I bring you, Stan, before I bring you in, I want to hear from Nakia. You're the youngest person on the panel. I mean, does this idea of a voice speaking to Parliament, advising on Aboriginal issues and policy, and perhaps even a political one, does that appeal to you?
Look, I have two thoughts about this. The first is, I think that our legal mechanisms, if we do have a body, I personally think it needs to have statutory power. I think it needs to be able to have legal autonomy for self-determination. I think Aboriginal people need to make decisions for ourselves, because historically, when white people have made decisions for Aboriginal people, regardless of the Aboriginal people who have given them advice, they haven't been necessarily great ones. For example, the stolen generation. So I think, we need to start looking at legal mechanisms that actually empower some type of statutory self-determination for Aboriginal people. Because the thing is, when we're talking about our voice, Aboriginality is not everyone's solid state, so to speak. There's an intersection of gender, of class. Each community is different, whether that be geographical location, cultural, tribal communities, or where you're from. So I think that it's all well and good to have this at the top end and have this executive change, but we need to make sure that we have legal mechanisms that include Aboriginal differences, and also that don't just work from the top down, but also from the bottom up. Because there's no use having this big executive change if the guts, such as funding from the guts, are getting ripped out of funding for Aboriginal services.
I just wanted to make this point, and just by way of illustrating why something like this is necessary and what the historical legacy is. In 1901, when the states federated into the Commonwealth, we had no political rights. At the point of contact, this was declared terra nullius, empty land, and our rights to land and our political voice was extinguished. So we did not sit down with the other founding fathers when the states came together to decide how we would share power. Could you really imagine if a constitution was being written today with the acknowledgement of our rights at law, with native title, with the land that is held by Indigenous peoples, that we would not have a seat at that table and that we would not be involved in sharing that power? And that's where we're at now, 200 plus years after settlement and 100 plus years after federation.
Now, Stan, I'm just going to think about the politics here. As soon as you say the word power and associate with a new body that's going to be blessed by the Constitution and put into place by the Parliament, certain politicians are going to get uppity about that. That's already happening. What do you see as the political consequences of this decision to push in this direction? Well,
it's an acknowledgement that the power vacuum already exists, Tony. And it's an acknowledgement that we live in a contested democracy. We don't just live in an electoral democracy where your vote just decides everything. The voices of minorities, the voices of the 49.5% who did not vote for the government of the day are not extinguished at the ballot box. Our voices still need to be heard. Democracy is a contested space. So of course it is questions of power and how you're able to exercise power within a democratic framework. I don't think it's anything to be scared of. We do it all the time.
Okay, let's bring Megan in. You've been saying for a long time that Aboriginal people, Aboriginal communities are not prepared to accept symbolic change. How fundamental is this particular change to have this voice empowered, enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, I suppose having the voice enshrined in the Constitution is symbolic of the fact that we are or have been voiceless and powerless, and that's certainly what the dialogues have said. From very early on after the expert panel, it became apparent, though, that symbolism, the statement of acknowledgement, would not be acceptable, or should I say meaningful, recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And that's what the Uluru Statement showed.
Okay, politics obviously going to play a role here. We've just started talking about it. We've got a question on this from Keith Bender.
Thanks. Look, in response to Uluru, the Prime Minister said, and I'll just read it out to you, a constitutionally conservative nation must be persuaded that the proposed amendments respect the fundamental values of the Constitution and will deliver precise changes that are clearly understood to be of benefit to all Australians. Does the panel think that the Prime Minister might have just missed an opportunity to show real leadership in outlining or highlighting his responsibility, his role in leading the explanation of change, in leading the persuasion of the nation to vote for change?
Okay, we'll start with Noel Pearson.
You need 90% of the country on board. Majority of voters in a majority of the states is the rule. And we need a campaign like 67 that gets 90% of the country putting their hands up. In my view, that is why I have worked so assiduously in getting Conservatives to understand the challenge here.
So, Noel, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is a constitutional Conservatives that you've been talking to for a long time. Are they on board with the idea of building this new institution that you're talking about, this voice to the Parliament, this elected Indigenous body enshrined in the Constitution?
So some of these constitutional Conservatives have formed an organisation called Uphold and Recognise. Uphold the Constitution and recognise Australia's Indigenous peoples. Now, that is the formula that can bind us all together. I think we want recognition, and there's a large swathe, particularly on the right, who are concerned about upholding the Constitution. Now, there's a ginger group of Conservatives who brought those two concepts together. In relation to the immediate response over the weekend, we would probably be in a better position today had there been more considered responses over the last 48 hours. This is it was a profound moment at Uluru. It was a culmination of the work of these two ladies here who led the dialogues relentlessly for 6 months. And a consensus position was reached. And, it was a bit disappointing that we didn't pause and honour the statement. Lyndon Johnson brought civil rights by playing a very long game, going way back in his political career, plotting the day when he would one day have the opportunity to work with civil rights leaders to deliver change. Now, that may be absent here in Australia, but in a sprightly fashion, the political class in this House have got to get organised. We have an opportunity here. This particular phase is 10 years old now. 2007 was the kick-off, and we're in year 10. I think there's a window here that we can seize, but the political leaders of the country have got to do a lot of catch-up. There's been no Lyndon Johnson plotting and trying to crowbar planets into alignment. And I think that the salutary lesson out of Uluru is that absent is back.
Okay, Noel, sorry to interrupt you. Pat, could you just address the question about the Prime Minister's role in this? Do you think Malcolm Turnbull will come on board with the ideas that you've expressed at the Uluru Convention?
Let me answer it this way. For any real political, social change, one has to imagine a new future. You have to be aspirational, you have to inspire a new change, a new future. And that's what's not happening in the country today. So we have to focus, we have to imagine a new future so we can move to that. So not kind of pull back, but try to move forward. And we don't see that in the leadership, this aspirational approach to change and to a new future. And that hasn't happened yet. And the other thing, though, that's happened, as I agree with Noel, there hasn't been enough time to really reflect. This is a time now, after the Uluru statement, the statement from the heart, to reflect. Just take some time to reflect upon what it is that we're saying to you. It's not the time we have, people, politicians and others coming out and we're going to blow this out of the water before we even begin the trek. So I'm just urging everybody to just relax, enjoy and savour the moment, at least until the Referendum Council can do its report, which is due at the end of June.
Okay, our next question is about that precisely, Pat. It's from Katie Ward. Go ahead, Katie.
Hi. So several members of Parliament recently have warned against the overreaching nature of putting a recognition question to a referendum, and they've been advising about the necessity for such a question to be easily consumed by the public. So in this instance, what would such a question look like in order for it to be easily sold to the public?
Megan Davis.
I'm not going to get into drafting of questions at the referendum. We're not really there yet. On the issue of overreach, the actual reform is quite modest. It's actually quite common in many parts of the world, in particular Western liberal democracies. These are the kinds of things that were spoken about in the dialogues. I just want to build on something Pat said about law reform. I mean, we went into communities and asked them to come and sit with us about this word recognition, and it began very difficult to get people to engage when they're struggling in their communities to get control over their lives. Part of law reform is imagining that the world can be better. That is what law reform is about. That is what the Uluru Statement is about. It is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities saying, look, we sat together, we've done this process for 6 months, we sat together in Uluru, we conceived of what we thought is meaningful reform that we think is the solution to the problems in our lives. We didn't, in the dialogues, ask people to engage in political calculations. That's why politicians were not...
Megan, the political calculations are being made. The overreach statement was made by the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce. He's, as I described earlier, thinks what you're talking about is something that's going to override
so two things.
The political chambers.
One, he hasn't read the report. That's one important point. The second one is that he's inaccurate. It's not true. It's not a third chamber of Parliament. Two simple points.
Nakia and Stan, briefly on this. Start with Nakia.
Look, we keep pretending that this conversation is, the politicians' approach is as if it's coming from this equal footing. And, our democracy is always tempered by a political reality. But the fact is that we have an oppressed minority, that's the Aboriginal people, trying to negotiate within a power structure of non-Aboriginal people who have a colonial majority. So I think what my fear is that the government is setting up a narrative that's saying that we are asking for the impossible and therefore we are dooming ourselves. And that because we asked for the impossible, that is why we didn't succeed. And that is incorrect because we are ready to commit. And I think that's what the Uluru Statement was saying, is that we are coming to the table, you come and meet us halfway. So it's not impossible to us. And if it's impossible to you, Barnaby Joyce, then why are we having these conversations? The Constitution isn't founded on fair principles for everybody. The Constitution is founded on invasion and genocide, and the Constitution isn't fair because we can look at that looking at the statistics of Aboriginal people. So to say that we are coming from a fair place, we're not. We have come and we have said to you, we have put forward our mission statement, we're asking you to have hope with us, and to be fair, I think having a little bit of hope is the least they can do.
Okay, Stan. Yeah. You know politics well, you know this chamber, you've worked here. How political is this going to get?
It's going to get very political, but here's the thing. I think our politicians sell us short as a nation all the time. I don't think that there is enough faith in the capacity of Australians to understand and decide for themselves. Australians decide what Australia is. We define Australia. The other thing you don't want to underestimate is the persistence and the patience of our people. The persistence and the patience of our people. When we stood in 1938 on a day of mourning, when we signed the Yirrkala petition, the Larrakia petition, the Barunga Statement, rebuffed. And look at these two. Look at Pat and Megan, who have been all around the country. Look at the people who have stood up in protests, the people who are still camped on the lawn outside of Parliament. And I was there this afternoon sitting down with people around the fire and talking about this stuff. My father, who has never given up hope. Don't underestimate the goodwill of Australians, and don't underestimate the patience and persistence of our people, because they're not going away.
Thank you. Now, remember you can join the discussion at Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio right after this program. Now, our next question comes from Crystal Hurst.
Hi. In Uluru last week, over 50 delegates walked out in protest as part of the constitutional reform debates and discussions. Those people, the delegates, rejected constitutional recognition. They demanded a sovereign treaty with an independent sovereign treaty commission governed by the Vienna Convention of the Laws of Treaties. Why not sovereign treaties now and perhaps constitutional reform later?
Yep, Pat, we've been hearing this phrase treaty now for a very long time. It came up again at Uluru, but it didn't carry the day, obviously.
Yeah. First of all, it was sad that we did have that walkout. It wasn't 30, it was about 7 delegates. There was a larger group that did walk out when we felt very sad about that. But I think they were concerned that the process was going to say something about our sovereignty. Now, all of the dialogues across the country, at every dialogue, everybody said we will do nothing that was going to abrogate Aboriginal sovereignty and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty. So I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. But this, as a result of the Uluru Statement, there's a roadmap, so there'll be a whole lot more talking over the next few months so we can settle any misunderstanding. So it was sad at the time, it was a small number of delegates accompanied by a larger group of people, and it was sad at the time, but I think we can resolve the misunderstanding between us all. So
Pat, very briefly, is this an acknowledgement that you can't put the treaty idea into the referendum?
We had a lot of discussion about strategy, obviously, and staging. There's 2 doors here. We're going to go through one, the constitutional door, and then we go through a treaty and agreement door. We were asked to consult on a voice to Parliament, head of power, etc., including agreement making. And the strategic consensus around the 12 dialogues and reached at Uluru last week was we've got to go through the constitutional door first and create a voice that is then in a position to sit down with Parliament and do agreements. That's the logic. Through one door first, and then we approach the other door. So, you know, the whole permutation of turning that around and doing a treaty first and then seeking constitutional reform was discussed at great length. But the consensus around strategy was go through the C door first. And it's a hard door to get into. Majority of voters in a majority of the states. But if we succeed in that, and in my view, we've been 10 years into this. We should cut to the chase now and have a question in the next 12 months. Let's have a referendum in the next 12 months. We've been 10 years into this thing. We'll be into year 11 if we put it off too much longer. I think there's tremendous goodwill in the Australian community for a successful referendum. The challenge for us is to get through the first hurdle, which is this Parliament. And we can only do that if Australians of goodwill help us persuade these guys in relation to what is a set of modest but profoundly important proposals.
Okay, so the treaty question will be discussed by another body called the Makarrata Commission. We've got a question on that. It's from Ernst Wilhelm.
Thank you. My question concerns the possible arrangements for a Makarrata or treaty. We know that at the time of British settlement or invasion, if you prefer that term, Australia was already well populated. There were some 300 tribes or language language groups or First Nations. Some of those survive. Many have been forced off their traditional lands. Many have not survived. Do members of the panel envisage a series of individual treaties with individual First Nations? And if that's what's envisaged, how would that structure accommodate those who've been forced off their traditional lands, those who have moved to towns and cities? Can that structure accommodate all Australia's Indigenous people?
I'll start with Megan on this.
Oh, look, what happened at Uluru was we have synthesised what it is that people have said that they want in terms of reform. Many aspects of what that commission might look like, particularly with respect to First Nations and the representative function, were raised and ventilated in those meetings and will be subject to the report.
Megan, can I just get you to explain for the audience who might get a bit confused about the number of bodies we're talking about? The Makarrata Commission is not something that's going to be enshrined in the Constitution. This is separate to the referendum question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's important to point out, I think, here, because it touches upon the previous questioner's question, and that is the word recognition. So the point was made that constitutional recognition was rejected. Well, recognition is a very complex legal and political term. It can mean acknowledgement, it can mean amendment to the race power, but it means treaties as well. So that's one important point, because it explains why Aboriginal people lost faith in this process, and it explains why the politicians are acting so shocked, because they didn't really, I suppose, grapple with the options that were already on the table. There were many forms of recognition on the table, not just the one that means the dictionary meaning, acknowledgement. It was always more than that. So in relation to these options, yes, one is a legislative, would be a legislative creature, and the other would be constitutionally entrenched. But it's also an important point to make there that the Makarrata Commission is a part of what Aboriginal people regard as meaningful constitutional recognition. I think it's a very impoverished view of the constitutional system to think just big C constitutional change is constitutional recognition. It's not.
Who'd be on it, though? Because, I mean, if you have an Indigenous voice speaking to Parliament about legislation, would the same people be on the Makarrata Commission?
You know, the Commission would have to be designed in a process with Parliament. It would have to be legislated. But the general model is that it would be an umpire that sits between the government and the Parliament and the First Nations of Australia and supervise agreement making. So it would be in the form of an eminent umpire, like the Waitangi Tribunal in New Zealand, that would be legislated to perform this function of supervising agreement making, and importantly, a series of agreements down at the local level, at the First Nation level. In order for that to happen, there would have to be a framework agreement nationally that would set up the architecture to enable case-by-case local agreements between First Nation communities and the government and Parliament of the day. But all of that will need to be articulated in legislation. The Makarrata Commission, in my view, is the creation of a formal independent umpire that would sit between and supervise agreement making.
Very ambitious agenda, isn't it?
There is one other function as well. One of the other things that came out very strong in all of the dialogues was that there needed to be some truth-telling. So there need to be some settlement. We have to all share. There might be a bit of bloodletting, but we have to do this, I think. And then we're in a better position then. Once we've been through a truth-telling process, then we will be, the whole country, all of us will be in a better position to say, well, okay, let's do some settlement now and settle this business between us.
Tony, your comment about ambition, we already do agreements under the Native Title Act.
Yep.
You know, over millions of hectares of land, and this has been going on for 25 years. The City of Perth has been subject to an agreement and so on. So the negotiation, they're treaties in a sense. in relation to land, it is just that in the future it'll extend beyond land issues to health and education and government services and everything else.
Okay, we're running out of time. We're going to go to a few more questions. We've got one from Michael Nguyen Kim.
We've heard a lot recently about the importance of widespread community support in ensuring the success of the constitutional changes proposed at Uluru last week. However, according to Reconciliation Australia, as many as 6 in 10 non-Indigenous people, myself included, have never personally met an Indigenous person. How can we therefore expect the general public to fully empathise with the importance of these changes to Indigenous people if they don't have this understanding?
Now, Michael, I suggest you stay around after the show because quite a few Indigenous people in this audience you can meet. Nakia, it's a pretty profound point, though, isn't it, Nakia Louis?
Look, I think it's a very, it's a complex question because I would say to you, how many people have you met that you know of? You know, you could have met a lot of Aboriginal people where, like, I don't know, the mafia was sneaking around everywhere. It's maybe what you think an Aboriginal person is, you know. I think, however, you don't need to have a lived experience of engaging with someone to have empathy. You know, I think we know what is right and wrong in this country because, boy, do we know when we're not doing the right thing because we do it quite often. And so I think, you know, when it comes to this idea of reconciliation, I think reconciliation is, I think at times it's a politicised term. It means something different for me than it does for you. Because I feel as an Aboriginal person, I've reconciled with, you know, non-Aboriginal people all the time. They're on my land. The trauma and the history of genocide and invasion in this country isn't that far down my family. It's not that far removed from me. So I think when we talk about reconciliation, we have to be asking who is reconciling what? You know, and that's actually a very political question. But in terms of, you know, I don't believe that statistic, you know, that, well, gosh, that sounds silly, I don't believe that statistic, but I think, you know, when it comes to have you met an Aboriginal person, I think people can sometimes have quite strict ideas about what they think an Aboriginal person looks like. They might not think I'm an Aboriginal person. They might not think one of my sisters are an Aboriginal person. So, you know, I think it's how we physicalise what we think the other is.
Stan.
I think we get it around the wrong way. You know, we've been trying to shoehorn a process of reconciliation for a long time, and there are all sorts of symbols and moments attached to that that still does not go hand in hand with the fundamental political reform that they're talking about out of Uluru. I don't think it matters so much whether we can hold hands. I think it matters more that we get the mechanisms right so that the people, the Indigenous peoples of Australia, have the voice that that we require, that we have the capacity to have that input into controlling our own lives. And if we reconcile, we reconcile. But I think when we put reconciliation first, before you have the real political structure, we've got it the wrong way around.
Yeah, that's exactly.
So, Pat, I can hear you saying yes there, so pick up that point.
Yes. We haven't told the truth yet. There's nothing to sort of reconcile. We're still, split asunder. So there needs to be that truth-telling.
Well,
so we
Pat,
can better
can I just interrupt because you
understand
mentioned this before, and I don't think a lot of people may not have realised that what you're essentially talking about is a truth and reconciliation process.
Yes, a truth.
Something like we may have seen in South Africa, for example.
And in Canada. They had a Truth and Justice Commission there, and the whole country had a conversation for nearly 2 years. And the conclusion they came to at the end was, hang about, our constitution doesn't suit who we are today, so let's have a new one. That's what they decided in Canada.
You know what the beauty is too, Tony, is that you need a story of a nation. You need a story before you can deliver yourself to that point. What is the story of us? You know, the poet Byron Shelley said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, because it is those stories that bind people together to make the changes that we think are right for all of us in a nation.
We're fast running out of time. We've got time for one last question, though. It comes from Natasha Radol.
So I am school captain of my school in Canberra, one of the few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander school captains in Australia. And I was wondering what each of you thought is the next step for the youth leaders of today.
Megan, can I start with you there? And you can reflect on the previous question as well.
Yeah, I'm no longer
Youth. Reflect on your youth.
Don't undersell yourself, Megan. You look very youthful to me.
Oh, thank you very much. I feel very, very tired. Well, I mean, one of the most amazing things I think that happened out at Uluru was the number of young people participating. It was quite extraordinary. A lot of them turned up to the dialogues, and then a lot got elected and came to the convention. And their contribution was exceptional. And now they're all geared up to work together with the rest of the working parties that has been established at Uluru to push these reforms through. I think in terms of the Uluru Statement and what's beneath it, in terms of the Referendum Council's report, one of the most important things our young people can do is get behind that.
Pat, do you think that will happen, and how important is it? Because what you're talking about here is substantive change. I don't think people realised more broadly in the community the degree to which you would be recommending such big changes.
It's really important that you inform yourself. You know, I'm of the generation where we fought tooth and nail. We hardly had any of us who'd completed year 12. In fact, I left school at 15. My mother was not educated at all, never went to school. She was very smart. But it was a policy of the day that she, in fact, not go to school, that she not be educated, that she not learn these new ways. So we've come a really long way, and for you to stand up there as a school captain, it's very reaffirming, and we're on the right track. And we fought for more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids to complete year 12, and you're already there. This is your turn. Those of us who were 18, changes and stuff that we've been talking about tonight, it's this generation's turn to run at it and make changes. So you're in a really good place to take up the cudgel or the fighting stick that was given, it's a kudra, that was given to Megan by the Anangu people at Mutijulu. That's what you need, a big woman's fighting stick.
Hey, no, stay there. Natasha, I just, as obviously a young Indigenous person, you've been listening to this. Are you inspired by it? Do you think the kind of changes you're hearing here, the sort of things you want to see?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard to get lost in all the problems that are of today, and to see people get up and tell you that we're on the right track and that we still need to fight and kind of guide us on the way. It's really inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nakia, you're the youngest person on this panel. What do you think?
You know, I think what stands, that the quote you said about poet and about creating a myth and being a part of the story is incredibly important. And I think as an Aboriginal person, no matter how different our politics and our ideology are, we may not have a consensus with all of our issues, but we can still have unity and we can still support each other. You know, as I'm growing up, gosh, I'm not that young, but that is, I think it's really important to support every step that we make, and we don't have to agree with it. But we can have compassion and empathy for our fellow Aboriginal people, and just don't shut up, okay? Because this world is going to want to shut you up. It's happening now, you know, in the conversation between coming out of the Uluru Statement and our politicians. They don't want Aboriginal people to have a voice, or have a voice that is different. And the thing that you can do is you can contribute to the myth that is Australia, and by contributing to that myth, you can actually create a future. And by recognising the path, you can actually break the foundation that racism, that oppressive power structures are founded on, and that makes a difference because you're creating space.
Now, Nakia, I don't want to shut you up, but...
Oh, please do.
I have to, because that's all we've got time for tonight. In fact, we're over time. Please thank our panel, Megan Davis, Pat Anderson, Noel Pearson, Nakia Lewis, Stan Grant, the Australian Parliament, the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, and this great audience. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, remember that you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and the CEO of the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence, Kirsty Parker, on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. And we'll return to the issues raised tonight when Q&A joins the Gama Festival in August. Now, next Monday on Q&A, the Minister for Social Services, Christian Porter, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, Anthony Albanese. the Liberal Democratic Senator David Leyonhjelm. And we'll close tonight with Sally Scales, the young Deputy Chair of the APY Lands, reading the Uluru Statement from the heart. Until next week, good night.
We, gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nation of the Australian continent and its adjacent lands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time memorial, and according to science, more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion that the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who are born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the base of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That people possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantial constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at an unprecedented rate. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. This dimension of our crisis tells plainly the structural nature of our problems. This is a torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reform to empower our people and to take a rightful place in our own country. When we have a power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift in their country. We call for the establishment of First Nation voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nation and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of Australian people for a better future.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A Extra now on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live.
The former Russian spy was poisoned by radioactive polonium.
The unbelievable international manhunt.
I'd been outmaneuvered like a chess